once again to the Holistic Capitalist. This video is part of a series that we've been doing dealing with the three most important axioms in our model of holistic capitalism. To recap, these critical axioms are that the experience employees, customers, and communities have with capitalism will come to mirror each other over time. Now, the reason for that is that each of these constituents interface with the same common denominator, which of course is capitalism, or we as capitalists ourselves. This idea is foundational to a lot of the blogs and videos that we'll publish in the future, and we hope these axioms will help us explore the polarizations and synergies that exist between each of these parts. In the first video in this series, we focused on the polarity defined by the employee experience with capitalists and vice versa. This was done with a dialogical mindset, attempting to gain real insight into each experience, the employee's experience with capitalist leaders, and honestly the experience that capitalist leaders have with our employees. In a similar way, the second video focused on the polarity defined by the experiences customers have directly with capitalism, and again, vice versa. This is actually tied or linked to the capitalist employee experience, because if your real connection with your employees is only a programmed or a pro forma attachment, you probably have the same kind of formal relationship with your customers and not a real connection. So, let's finish this three-part series by focusing on the community experience with capitalists. Communities are really the most complex aspect of our model. There are so many different types of communities to take in within that one word. Obviously, communities are the towns in which we live, have facilities in, and recruit many of our employees from. But that's just the beginning. There are also virtual communities that we recruit from nationally or even internationally, and that we market products through and connect with in so many ways online. If we stop and think about it, the sources of raw materials, our supply chain, are also a sort of a community. Sources of energy are a community. Sources of new technology are a community of universities and specialized consortiums. This varies by industry. Some companies invest a lot in their own R&D, and others have to tap these, other companies tap these other sources. For example, energy companies, or utility companies, I should say, tend to rely on these common consortiums for new technology. The moral beliefs and multiple worldview perceptions of the different societies in which capitalism functions are also from the community. The legislators and legal system in which capitalism is framed, and most importantly is regulated, is also a community. Now, this in and of itself touches a lot of dimensions. Foreign trade policies that seem to encourage a sort of self-defeating anti-commitment to local communities in favor of a global community. How can capitalism help to sort that out and regain balance to that? This is a polarity that is impacted both domestically but also globally as multinational companies interface with the different countries in which they do business. Now, we can extend from there into the legal community, where there are taxation policies and regulations that either encourage or discourage entrepreneurship. And this is still just the beginning. There is ecological regulation, which is the result of a community which stimulated the capitalist response to the green movement. And we often cite that as a classic example of the need for holistic capitalism. Accounting standards are also a community, and conventions are held every year to talk about those standards and teach people as they evolve. Shareholder or investor SEC regulations are a pretty complex and often criticized community as well. Benefit plan regulations such as the Affordable Health Care Act or HIPAA, and even if the Health Care Act is replaced, there will be other regulations, and there are reporting regulations, filings that have to be done for benefit programs, fiduciary responsibilities and audits, and so on. So it gets very, very involved and very, very complicated. So you can see that the community experience is actually a very complex one. And one of the things that in some aspects companies have valued very highly, but other times we've kind of ignored that or undervalued it, and certainly not seen opportunities in that community environment to exploit those for strategic advantage. Now, it seems that communities often experience capitalists as greedy, lacking a sense of social context, or even are soulless, as was stated by President Obama in a recent speech not too long ago. If you want to learn more about that, see my video, Obama Revealed, a dialogical exercise, and you can learn more about it. As we also mentioned several times in other blogs and videos, the fact that pollution and the degradation of our global environment, all of which are costs that ultimately are accounted for by all of society, these went unrecognized by traditional capitalist organizations for decades. And we believe that signaled an incomplete paradigm. And the fact that that happens is not missed by the community. It appears to our communities that capitalists are so consumed with the expectations of shareholders as the only constituency that unless there exists a direct threat to the corporate bottom line through regulatory requirements, the larger context of the community appears to be little more than an afterthought. Even some of the companies that declare a corporate social responsibility initiative seem to have co-opted these efforts into the same pro forma or corporate PR sounding efforts that leave some people more doubts than a sense that there's a real understanding and a real connection to the experience of communities. Lastly, let's turn our attention to the capitalist experience with communities and flip it around the other way. Now, there are many capitalists I've known who care deeply about their communities, but often they rarely have the time or resources to devote to the community, unless forced by regulation, of course. To repeat the theme running throughout our model, in large part, this is a function of the paradigm itself. With the exception of possible punitive regulations, it just isn't established within capitalism to recognize and account for community issues as a source of strategic threat or opportunity for differentiation, competitive advantage, and sustained ROI. Similarly, the unwillingness or inability of society, at least in the past, to recognize these vast costs has sometimes acted as an enabler of the old paradigm and helped companies to remain blind to the effects of these things and to consider the community aspect out of scope for their paradigm and their responsibility as leaders. But increasingly, this is changing. Customers, communities, and governments are becoming less tolerant of this sort of negligence over time. This is in large part because of the increased speed of community awareness, obviously brought on by the modern age of the internet. Companies that don't adapt and incorporate community experience considerations into their strategy and into their way of doing business could fail. If that happens, creative destruction, which is a principle of capitalism, would continue and start to replace those companies with companies that tend to have a greater range of strategic concerns. Now, if we're right, the extension of the capitalist paradigm will translate into real market forces and opportunities for competitive advantage. The great hope is that the inroads into sustainability will go beyond cradle-to-grave material and waste streams, as good as those things are. Indeed, charitable outreach to communities appears to also be on the rise as an expansion of the greater green consciousness. Could some boards and some shareholders come to see that sustainable ROI may be better than quarterly volatility in returns? Whether it is the millennials, oppressive regulations, or increased global disruptions, or the increased pace of change spurred on by social media, more and more capitalists are seeing this disconnect and searching for a way to change the paradigm. And yet, much of capitalism still waits and then reacts to government forces rather than seeing the changing landscape and reinventing our own paradigm on our terms before external events dictate change in ways that may be less effective. If we can see the edge of the old paradigm, I believe we can self-organize to create the most effective win-win balance needed to grow wealth and prosperity throughout the world. So let's summarize what we've learned from all three of the videos in this series. Our point is simply this: the capitalist component of our model, the triangle, is the catalyst for transforming the paradigm of capitalism. Most of us do not start our careers disconnected from employees, customers, and communities. Somewhere along the way, for some, not all, the executive mindset settles in. Our own employee experience is an induction into an extremely high commitment environment, because we as capitalists are also employees. So our experience and the way this occurs is worth looking at. And it appears validated by our constant interface with the competitive realities, coupled with quarterly expectations to achieve shareholder results in very short time frames. A whatever it takes mindset starts to prevail. This is intuitively admirable given the stakes involved in a business. Or it might be if, in fact, most businesses operated on a complete holistic paradigm. Instead, it narrows the focus to a partial holism, a reduction from the larger holism into a smaller holism. And reductionism always reduces to just a pile of parts. Now, I hedged a little bit when I said all this high commitment level might be admirable, because I think one of the holisms we do need to think about is work-life balance. Can capitalists who are not whole and complete within themselves really create a genuine experience with customers, employees, and communities? Now, I do not raise this as a touchy-feely concern. As these blogs continue, you will start to realize that we really are talking about a transformative shift in paradigm that will make what seems real, urgent, imperative, and practical shift to some degree. And as it does, capitalists will be the catalysts for connecting the parts of the system of capitalism employees, customers, and communities, in the new paradigm, just as they are the catalyst that created and sustained the current paradigm and all of the great things it has accomplished. And if we do this, if we expand our paradigm, we will ourselves be a catalyst for good in the world and create a greater holism and a greater sustainable return. Now, in this particular video, I can only hint at how capitalism can interact differently with the different parts of the model. The hint is that the operator for changing holism is, in fact, dialogue. Now, capitalists are not monsters, and what happens to us in our employee experience isn't really different than what happens to everyone. After our induction into a well-intentioned but incomplete capitalist paradigm, we reduce these critical connections to concepts instead of real synchronistic relationships, and over time, increased polarity between the undervalued parts emerges to limit the success of capitalism. Sadly, for many of us, in the conversion to the incomplete paradigm, we may have sacrificed our connection to our families and even to ourselves. And so that may be the place to begin. Now, I'm not suggesting that great individual commitment isn't called for given the stakes in business. I am suggesting on a very pragmatic basis that finding this sort of personal holism is necessary if we as capitalists are to understand holism well enough to reinvent our own paradigm and create sustainable ROI by effectively turning the ignored dimensions of capitalism into real strategic opportunities. So that's our three-part series, and I appreciate you watching it. I know that it's been highly theoretical, and some of my business contacts have said, okay, that was good, but enough with the theory already. How about some practical examples? So in our next video, we'll start to explore some particular companies and some of the ways that we can see best practices starting to actually exhibit a more holistic capitalism. Thanks very much for watching the series. I appreciate it.